All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back to our Creative Pathways Talks here at E4 Youth. We are glad to see all of you here today. I am Jaleisha Bass, your host, and I'm a digital docent with E4 Youth. Today, we'll be interviewing Cara Andrade, who is a Ashoka Fellow who co founded the HablaCentro Informatics not for profit in LLC. It is a network of citizen journalism and information sharing hubs in Latin America that share reliable and timely updates from the ground during crisis. She was most recently a program director at the International Center for Journalists, directing programs in Costa Rica, Cuba, and Mexico. In the past, she was the senior innovation specialist for Counterpart International Innovation for Change initiative, which supported and started sorry, y'all, regional invention hubs in 7 regions, such as Latin America, the Caribbean, Middle East, North Africa, Africa, South Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, and even the Pacific. So she's also an adjunct professor and a PhD candidate at the American University School of Communication. Her work through her social venture research and work in development sector focuses on the adaptation and implementation of innovations to solve common democracy problems. So we have an amazing speaker here with us today. And so I cannot wait to listen to her talk and to pick her brain about her experiences as a journalist today. So let's welcome to the screen, Cara.
Hi, Delisha. Thank you so much. Really appreciate being on the show with you and all this E4 Youth crew. I really want to thank you for taking the time.
Yeah. So, just to jump right into things, how about we'll let you start and sort of introduce yourself to the people?
Sure. Well, first I want to give a shout out. Can I do a shout out?
Yeah.
I have to do a shout out to Umberto and Carl because I met them both many years ago when they were where E4 Youth was just a dream, and I wanna thank them for following their dreams and for making it a reality. And so I'm very grateful to have them as friends, to know them, and to have followed the trajectory of E4 Youth as they implemented step by step and brought in young people to also be part of making that dream happen. So. Just wanted to say hello. I also wanted to, I wanted to start out because, I'm a journalist, so we tell stories. And for the most part, the stories, they should be nonfiction, they should be true. But, we focus on stories. And so I wanted just to start out really fast with some just slides that I want to share with you. So I'm going to share it with on my screen here. And I know a lot of this is making sure the technical aspects work. So here we go. We should be able to see it. Delisha, do you see it?
Yep, I see it.
Perfect. So I call this, this story is really a story of me going from a banana plantation to the newsroom to the Ivory Tower. As you pointed out in my bio, Delisha, I'm still in school. It's a joke in the family. Like, when am I ever going to leave school? I've been there for a long time. And now I'm doing my PhD and talking about doing another one. And so I want to, that's my story. I have this photo of a place that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm not sure how clear it is for viewers, but this is an ungraded road in Guatemala. On the left side of the photo, stage left, are a bunch of banana trees, and on the right is you'll see a lot of palm trees. And so this is where I'm from. This is the road to one of the fincas that I grew up in. This is the road to Media Luna, or Half Moon, as they call it in English. And it's one of the small plantations in Guatemala. It's on the border with Honduras. And this is where I go to visit about 35 members of my family who still live there. And what you see, even in this photo, is a completely different world than one we're used to. And this is where I come from. It's been quite a journey. And so every time I go back to do reporting, to visit, to do stories for anything, I'm always reminded of the journey. And so what I want to share with you today is a little bit of that journey and how it ties into the work that I do in the newsroom when I report. And so, just like Jalisha shared with you, I do a lot of research and I'm a journalist. I'm an entrepreneur. I am currently doing my PhD. You can reach me on Twitter at NewMaya if you have any questions. I'll always make sure to follow up. A lot of my focus in the research and the reporting that I do is on technology, how technology and how people use technology from like cell phones, computers, like social media, how that ties in with how a country develops democratically, freedom of expression, how journalism also plays into that. And I really like to focus on Central America because that's where I'm from. And it's also a region that has gone through a lot of challenges, a lot of evolutions since, a lot of the different countries are just becoming into democracies or democratic systems. And so to me, it's a very interesting region. And what we're going to cover today is a little bit about my story, the reporting work that I've done. I know I'm going to answer some of your questions here, Jalisha, before you ask them, the role of a journalist, and then we can get into the Q&A. But first, I want to just kind of show you a little bit about my most recent work. This is a story that I did for the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. I think, Tin, you'll be queuing it up so we can watch it. It's about close to 3 minutes, but it goes really fast. And if you know Spanish, you can practice listening to the Spanish, which is very, very fast. So here we go.
Yo me considero un barrendero de la vida, que me toca barrer lo más feo, levantar los perros muertos y toda esa pendejada. Me intentaron matar varias veces.
Miguel Ángel Jiménez Blanco was a political activist and an organizer of the community police forces in Mexico. For this, many wanted him dead. Through the community police forces, Miguel Ángel wanted to wake the towns up with arms and stop the robbing, the rampant killing, the drug-related violence, and the corruption, which had infiltrated the local and national public processes and institutions. When 43 students were disappeared from a public rural teachers' college in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, Miguel Ángel was one of the first to tell the rest of the world of the disappearances. He used a WhatsApp group called Fuente Informativa to upload first-hand reports from Guerrero to a group of mostly international journalists.
Los que estamos en esto, comprometidos, sabemos que nuestra vida no vale ya no vale nada para nuestro gobierno. En cualquier rato nos van a levantar. Y lo sabemos, por eso tenemos que aprovechar al máximo la comunicación.
During Mexico's contentious elections, Miguel Ángel collected voters' testimonies of alleged vote buying and coercion in San Marcos, Guerrero on June 13, 2015.
Estaba dando dinero.
Sí, le estaba dando 200 pesos por voto. Por voto.
Pero ¿cómo fue? O sea, ¿cómo es que le daba dinero? ¿Puede contar?
Bueno, a cambio del voto.
¿Votaba primero o le daba primero el dinero?
No, primero le daba el dinero.
Para que fueran a votar.
Para que fueran a votar, pero la estaba diciendo que fueran a votar.
I followed him while he did this. Miguel Ángel recorded testimonies with his cell phone and uploaded them to WhatsApp. Later, he told me they would be presented as evidence to declare votes in these towns illegitimate. He knows he's made enemies along the way, but it goes with the work.
Yo lo único que espero es que me mantenga luchando, es todo lo que espero, de la gente no espero nada. Ojalá y la gente reaccionara, que me gustaría, que la gente se organizara, que la gente entrara en comunión pueblo con pueblo, ¿me entiendes? Que luchen, es todo lo que espero de ellos.
On August 8th, Miguel Ángel's bullet-ridden body was found at the entrance to his hometown, Jaltianguis, along the road to Acapulco, Mexico. He was 45 years old.
Great. Well, thanks, Tim. Thanks for sharing that. I wanted to start that with you, share that that piece was a very difficult piece to report because I had been working with Miguel Ángel for more than a year. And when I was working with him, during, a lot of the reporting, the WhatsApp videos he was capturing, the testimonials, we were even being followed at that time. And so I know that he was constantly dealing with the threat of death for the work that he was doing. And so it's, I started working in Mexico. I expanded outside of Central America because Mexico as well is dealing with a lot of similar issues as we've been seeing in Central America, especially around narco trafficking, impunity, corruption, trafficking of arms, and all kinds of problems that are really impacting the kind of democracy that Mexico aims to be. And so I've done similar kinds of stories. I did one for Fusion TV, which is part of Univision. It's Fusion specifically focused for English-speaking people, audience from Latin America. And so we did a story on guns and gangs, tracing how the guns that are illegally exported to Mexico and Guatemala, actually all the way to El Salvador, impacts those regions and creates a lot of problems, both on the violence front, but also poverty, increasing poverty, corruption. We did another series called Waste, where we follow how, the kind of how when you pick, say, a perfect banana or like a perfect green bean at the store, how that impacts with like waste all the way to the beginning of the food chain to like the supermarket. And so it was a really interesting series. I also did a story that you can watch. This is on Netflix, called La Camioneta. And camioneta is in Guatemalan Spanish, refers to the decommissioned school buses that are converted and they become public transportation. And so we were looking at ways to tell the story of what immigration, how immigration happens, why people immigrate in a different way. And so the bus becomes like the protagonist for telling that story. And so I've done all these, that's kind of like the most recent work that I've done. So, but, I've done a lot of different types of reporting. This is a photo of me when I was working at the Oakland Tribune covering homicide. This is a long time ago. And, I always tell people I think I would have stayed on that beat because I really enjoyed covering crime in Oakland, California. And I enjoyed working kind of that traditional daily reporting gig. But unfortunately, the industry was tanking. A lot of consolidation was happening with different newspapers. And so there just weren't any jobs. And so you kind of, like most things, you have to improvise. And so, a lot of the way, the things that I learned and valued in my storytelling come a lot from like where I'm from, right? And so like, how I started out taking photos really comes back to like where I'm from and the story of how I got from a banana plantation to a journalist. And so I show you these three images because my family used to work for the United Fruit Company, and United Fruit Company had a big monopoly. I don't know if you read 100 Years of Solitude, but United Fruit Company is featured in the books that Garcia Marquez writes, all the way from Colombia through Mexico, right? It was like this banana empire. But so my family worked for them. My grandmother would sort out the most perfect bananas that were going to be exported to other countries, mainly the US. My mother would put the stickers. So you see the Chiquita sticker. My mom would put the stickers on bananas. My great grandmother helped to clean the bananas and so on and so forth, different members of the family. This was the old logo of the United Fruit Company. And then in 1981 or 82, I can't remember the year exactly, the United Fruit Company, the monopoly was broken. And there's a whole series of political things that go with that. But it broke up into like Del Monte, Dole, Chiquita. And these are labels that you might even have picked a label off your banana this morning that said Del Monte or Chiquita. And so that's where we used to work. And then when the monopoly ended and all these companies were privatized, the smaller companies, we had to move to Guatemala City. This is what Guatemala City looked like in the day, and to look for work. And there's one thing to, have been working for a big company that paid for your housing and your, you know, everything, schooling. I was even born in the Banana Fruit Company, in the United Fruit Company hospital. And then it's another thing to go to a city, right? And you have absolutely no support, right, to help you with anything. And so this is what we came into, and my mother decided at the time. This is when I was living in Guatemala City, 1 month before I left for the United States. My mother, here she is, she decided that we just couldn't keep on this way. And so and you know, when anybody asked her like why she came to the United States, she says, well, I was hungry, right? Like we did suffer a lot of poverty at the time. The country was going through civil war as well, so we weren't the only groups of people suffering at that time. There's a lot of mass murders. It has been often referred to as genocide. And so the country was just in a difficult place, and so were its people. And so my mother decided to become a coyote. Well, a coyote of sorts, right? At the time, mostly it wasn't like there wasn't like a big business, right? People were just mostly trying to stay alive. And so they would teach themselves how to get from their countries to the United States, right? And so coyote or coyote in Spanish is the word for, well, a people smuggler. And so my mother learned from another, she was an ayudante, she was kind of mentored by another people smuggler, how to learn the route, and she learned the route. And then when I asked her like what made her even think about the United States, she said that she had seen a postcard that had this skyline of Los Angeles in the sunset, and she was like, that's where I want to be, right? So she had this this vision for a completely different life, and so that's what drove her to make this pretty perilous journey from Morales y Zabal, well, that's where we're from, and Guatemala City's right below it, all the way to, I don't think you can see it, but it's off the screen, but it's Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And that's a really long trip. That was one of many trips she did, but this is the trip that she did particularly with myself and my immediate family. And we made some part of that trip in a camioneta. Here's a school bus, decommissioned school bus that's been converted. It's not like the school buses you're used to, but it was at some point a yellow school bus, I assure you. It was driven back to Guatemala, and it is transformed completely, and it's even baptized by the town, and the buses are the lifeline for people to get to work and also to get to the border and to get to other countries. And there's a similar type of network of buses in Mexico as well. So we rode a lot of these buses, we walked, we hitchhiked, trains, whatever we could get to get to the border. And eventually we did get to Lancaster County. Lancaster County is known for Hershey Park, the famous home of the Hershey Kisses. And we ended up there, well, because there was a lot of work, right? And so this is one of the first photos we took when we got there. It is a Polaroid. So I don't know if you've ever seen a Polaroid camera. I know they're doing the digital Polaroids, but this is actually a Polaroid. And you know, one of the things when people ask me, well, what even got you thinking about like stories and like, you know, like this is what you wanted to do, you know, and I think it really started with that trip, because one of the things my mom told me, I don't know if she was doing it because she's trying to keep me from crying, or I was just kind of being annoying as a kid, you know, when we started this trip, but she bought me a little disposable camera like these Kodaks. I know now they're digital, but back then it was like 25 exposures, and she gave me this camera and she said, hey, you know, take pictures of our trip, because someday, you know, somebody might need to know how to do this too, you know, and that's what I did. Unfortunately, I did take all 25 pictures the first hour. And then I asked her for another one, and my mom was like, we're not made of money. So she gave me, you know, a notebook and some paper and pens. And then she said, well, now you gotta write it. You gotta write it like you would tell it to somebody, like somebody would visualize it in their head, right? Like basically create a picture in their head. And so that's what I did, right? And so, you know, along the way, she had brought a Sony Walkman with her from the US, and it was the most amazing thing. I had one tape that I listened to the whole way, and it was Kenny Rogers, The Gambler. and I still have these lyrics memorized to heart. You know, you got to learn to play the game, and you got to learn to play it right. And so I sang that song, and that's the homework my mom had given me. She's like, you got to sing this like you're a kid from the U.S., so that when we cross the border, they think that you were just visiting Mexico, right? And so that's what I did when we were crossing the border. And this is the border back in the 80s. It looks nothing like this now. It's a bit more militarized. And we crossed over in a cab, and sure enough, the INS, now they're called ICE official, asked my mom where we're going, and then he asked me, and then I just sang Kenny Rogers while I was playing the Sony Walkman, and that's how I got in. And then once we were in the United States, you know, we were undocumented. I grew up undocumented, and that's a weird term, right? I'm glad it's not like an alien anymore, because that's what used to be the term for us. For me, I never felt undocumented because I had Guatemalan documents, but I didn't have U.S. documents. But so I grew up without U.S. documents or U.S. papers, and we moved around a lot looking for work. Motel 6 was usually our choice rest stop for new locations. I did expand my music preferences to Freddie Fender, and well, we joined a big tide of workers, right? And so I know in the United States in a very different way than most people know. I've lived, I think at one point I counted, I've lived in about 18 states. I've gone to at least half a dozen schools because we've moved so much. And part of my work, you know, this is me in typical experience in lunchrooms. I dreaded lunchrooms and these terrible things called tater tots. And then in 1987, Ronald Reagan signed a naturalization bill. It was the last big immigration reform, sadly. It was that long ago. I hope there's a new one coming. It's needed. And so he did create a lottery, and we became permanent residents, and that created the pathway for us becoming citizens. As we were maneuvering all this terrain, I became quite a researcher, because I was the one that was in charge of filling out a lot of the forms and making sure that we were going to the place we were supposed to. I was the translator. I was, you know, if we had to go to the records office, I had the one to actually make the records. I mean, like, I didn't know about FOIA, that's what it was called, but I knew how to use FOIA a long time before I knew what it was, right? And so I knew a lot about the way the infrastructure and the architecture of cities, places we would go to, because of, you know, I tended to be that bridge person, right? And then so that role is something that I kept with me. And so in journalism, I've been able to use it, right? And I still have my ties to Guatemala and to the rest of Latin America, because I still have family there, because a lot of my memories, a lot of the things that impacted me are things that I care about now, right? Immigration, you know, why people leave their countries, like what are the factors, the context in which they live and work that makes them uproot from their homes? Like, what are the things, who are the people who are not seen? What are their stories, right? So making the invisible visible, those are the things I care about, because I often felt invisible most of my life, or at least we attempted to be as invisible as we could so we could be safe, right? And so I've been reporting Latin America for more than 25 years, but I've also reported in the US quite a bit, right? I've covered, there's the Twitter co-founders with the story about Thanksgiving in San Francisco. I've covered a lot of crisis, protests. I've done some celebrity coverage, and that was pretty interesting. That's Francis Ford Coppola. And you know, Nicholas Kristof is one of the columnists that I read in the New York Times. And you know, one of the things I feel is really important about journalism is that it's not the most comfortable profession, right? Because oftentimes, you know, people are running the other way and you're running towards like a fire, right? You're running towards a crime scene or things that mostly make people uncomfortable. But I think it's a very essential role to play because, you know, you have to humanize the stories, and somebody has to be there to talk to somebody that is dealing with a tragedy, is dealing with something impactful, right? And so if somebody isn't there to capture and tell that story, there's no record of it, right? And there's no way to really humanize a statistic, right? I could say like, there's thousands of young people at the border being stranded at the border right now, but unless you actually start telling the stories of those young people that have come all the way from Bolivia walking, or from Guatemala or Mexico, and now are at the border, waiting on immigration cases to push through the courts. Like, I think people get lost, right, in those numbers. And so I think it's very important to be on the ground, right, to be that bridge. Something I'm well aware of in my life, and to really make a problem more concrete for people, right? The story that I shared with you at the beginning is a story that I did for the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. It's a story that it was kind of my version of Christophe. Christophe went to North Korea, and I was like, why would somebody go to North Korea, right? And when you think about the role of journalism, like Christophe was like, well, somebody's got to talk to North Koreans, right? Somebody's got to tell a story what North Koreans are dealing with. And so, I went to Mexico, so part of Mexico, Guerrero, which is it's going through a lot of difficulties, and so I wanted to go to Mexico, particularly Guerrero, to look at the ways that people are finding like little lights, right? What they're doing, not to kind of like create solutions for the problems that they're dealing with. And so it turns out technology was very important to Mexicans, right? Especially in their participation in democratic processes. Guatemala has also gone through very similar technological advances and democratization per se, where people are using social media in any way they can to tell their stories, to find jobs, for education, for governance, right? This is the municipality. They have like an e-lab, right? And people come in and learn languages or do classes online. And then there's always like a dark side, right? I'm always really interested in like seeing like, okay, well, not everything is like hunky-dory or good, right? Like what's the risk people have to take for using technology, right? And so this is someone that I know in Guatemala, John Fer, who was arrested for this tweet that says if the first actions to take the money out of Banco Rural, which is a public bank, and to break the bank of the corrupt in Guatemala, right? And so he was arrested pretty quickly afterwards for that tweet. It doesn't just happen in Guatemala, it's also happened in the US. It's happened in different countries where people get arrested for tweets. Different colleagues of mine and in the industry have been murdered. This is, is a professional crime reporter, Maria Macias. She was found decapitated in Nuevo Laredo for a tweet, and just on, right? And so like we go through, in journalism, we do the work, but it's not easy work. It's definitely something we have to be committed to for a bigger reason, right? With the Mexico story, I was really looking at following one person that was really engaged with the political situation and wanted to make a difference, right? He was a part of the what he called the community police forces, right, who are arming themselves to protect their communities against narco traffickers. In Guatemala, I also helped to cover the Rios Mon trial, right? And this is actually pretty significant because when they were trying Rios Mon, there wasn't a lot of documentation of him sending the orders for, a lot of mass murders of indigenous people in Guatemala. And so they had to really, the judges had to revert to letting, to admitting evidence, journalistic stories as evidence that he was the mastermind behind a lot of these orders sent out for the army to kill indigenous people. And so I think, journalism is important for this reason, right? Because you really have to tell the story how people on the ground are finding ways to face very difficult situations, right? They're not just passively waiting for things to happen to them, right? And so I leave you with this quote that Miguel Angel, when I asked him, we were driving through, it was really dark, he didn't have any gas, and we were just in the middle of nowhere in Guerrero. And I said, you know, Miguel, you could do a lot of other kinds of jobs. Like, why are you doing this? You know, it's pretty unsafe. You've got 7 kids. Like, and he says, well, I'm doing this for the love. He said, if I didn't have a clue about what I love, why would I struggle? Something has to sustain you for the struggle. And we all have a dog that chases us, a purpose to our struggle, right? And so I think that really resonated with me. And so I think the message I leave for you is I think it's very important to tell your story, right? And to also teach others what you learn. One of the stories that I really admired this young person that I interviewed. It's one of the stories that I did for Al Jazeera on minors who had crossed the border by themselves. And so he was one of them. And I said, hey, you know, you don't have to show your face for this story. He's like, no, I want you to tell my story, and I want people to know that it's my story, right? And so he turned around, and so I took his picture, and it was a moment of risk, but I think it was very important for him to be seen. And I think that's very powerful, right? So I want to leave you with that. Muchas gracias. And I know that we've probably gone a little bit over time, but there's probably time for questions.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you so much for sharing. You really highlighted a lot of points that, you know, I wanted to, you know, hear about as well with your experience. So I appreciate you sharing so freely. And with that, you know, just taking note of like the work that you've been doing as a journalist. You know, I know a lot of young people aspire to hear these stories and tell these stories as well. But it's sort of difficult getting to that point. And so I wanted, you know, to pick your brain a little bit about it more in depth on how you sort of like got into the field and why you decided to get a master's in journalism, and even getting your doctor's degree right now. Like, why did you make those decisions? Or, you know, how did you get a job out of things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't think there is any one pathway, and anyone who tells you that, I think is working under a false assumption. I think there are a lot of different. It's like a map, right? I'm into maps. Like, cartography is super interesting to me, mostly because I always grew up with maps, right? Because I was always my mom's like her co-pilot, because there was no Siri then. If you can imagine a coyote who had no sense of direction, but I did help her that way. And so, you know, I think the most important thing for anything that you do, whether it's creatively, and I think everything's creative, to be honest. I know that there's very set notions of what creative is, but I think you have to have that postcard in your mind, right? Of where you want to project to. And that's probably the most important thing. The in-between, you'll figure out. The things that for me have been incredibly helpful and instrumental in helping me figure out the mile markers in between is mentors, having people who can guide me. I think the other thing that's been incredibly helpful to me is this, you know, I'm constantly reading and in this process of self-formation and self-educating. Like, for me, it's not like, oh, go read books. For me, I think my biggest advice is like unstoppable learning. Like, learn, have insight from anywhere, anytime, at any moment of the day. Like, whether it's a podcast, whether it's an audio book, whether it's just an interview, a conversation with someone, like, just constantly, you know, embark and be a part of actively creating a learning journey for yourself. And to be constantly sense making, right? You have to make sense of things that happen in your life. And so I think for me, writing has helped me to make sense of things, because it forces you to order things, right? And to be an author of your own map, right? And so I think that's been super helpful. So I would say, like, mentors, research, and, like, you know, that drive to learn. I think the third thing is just be very open and curious. You know, don't be the first person to close the door on an idea. right? If someone says, hey, you know, we could go this way, you know, and you might have like that initial reaction, go, God, that's such a weird idea. But you go, hey, tell me a little bit more about that. How'd you get to that idea, right? Or if you see somebody that got somewhere that you want to get to, just go up to that person or write them or whatever and just say, hey, how did you get from here to here? Like, what is the thing that helped you get there? Like, what is the process, right? And so I think like just not being afraid to ask and to understand how, you know, how people are making their way through life is really, really important, because different people do it in different ways.
Right.
And so I think it's that that sense of being active in your life, right? And in shaping where you want to get to is really, really important. The one other thing I want to add, which I think is really important, is really like try to find ways to think about your life in a different way. You know, like in different phases of our life, we have different like glasses or frames from which to look at things, right? You know, for me, it's always been like, depending on the book, I'm like, oh yeah, you know, if I'm reading a book on trauma, I'm like, yes, I've been traumatized. It's terrible, right? Or if I'm looking at a book on, you know, whatever it is, I try on that lens. But I'd say like, most recently, I was reading a book by Nassim. He's an economist. He writes a book called Anti-Fragility. And he says at the beginning of the book, you know, that you could be like a candle, like a candle flame that any wind will come through and blow over, right? Or you can be more like a fire that will feed itself from any wind that comes, right? It actually strengthens from it. And I think you have to really decide what you want to do when wind comes your way. Do you want to try to create some kind of wall around yourself that protects you, right? But also keeps you from growing? Or do you want to just like find ways to grow from adversity, right? Find tools and ways of looking at things that help you get stronger, you know, from the chaos or from things that are just thrown your way that you're just like, well, what is that?
Most definitely. I want to go back for a second to the point you made about sense making. And I think that may make sense to me and you, but I'm not for sure if that would make sense to everybody else. So could you sort of describe like what that means to make sense of things, or what that reflection process looks like?
Yeah, I mean, like what's something lately, let's start with an example in your life. What's something lately that just has been completely confused you? It could be anything. It could be today.
The stimulus check is very confusing for me.
All right. So what's confusing about it?
I don't know if I qualify for it or not as a college student.
Right. Okay. So this is a good point, right? Because so what I do usually every day, I just like write a question like that, like, do I qualify? Or like I constantly am writing things. You see my notebook? There you go. Constantly full. Find some way to kind of what things that are going through your head that that are really just kind of you're questioning. Find a way to document that, right? Whether it's in your phone or a voice note, whatever you do. And then the next thing I do is then like I look it up. I just do a quick Google search, right? Do I qualify? Do high school students qualify for a stimulus check, right? I start the research. For me, it always goes back to research because that's what I know. But I'm not saying everybody should start there. I think research is very important, right? Because we're in a knowledge society now. Like it's like gone are the days where it's like, only certain people had access to the knowledge, to the libraries, to the scribes, right? Like anybody can have access to knowledge, right? And so then I try to find somebody I can talk to, right? Somebody who's like me, that has experience, right? And this goes back to the journalism too, right? Because in journalism, the typical formula for your basic story is, if this was a story that I was writing on for like the Daily Tribune or whatever, like a daily newspaper, I would interview first somebody who has received a stimulus check who's in my age group, right? Then I would interview somebody who hasn't received anything. And then I would interview an expert, like a government expert, right? And then I would probably interview an academic, right? And so then you've got 4 sources. And they might tell you completely different things, right? And so the more, and then you actually start constructing things based on like who you talk to that has a different level of expertise. And essentially, in theory, this is what journalism does for people, right? This is the role that journalism plays in society. It helps to inform people so that they can make decisions. Well, so they can make sense of something and then make a decision, right? And so in theory, you could look up that same question or just look up in different newspapers, you know, the question that you have. And from there, you might find a story, right? And in that story, they might quote some expert, some legal expert, some economic expert, some government person that you can then call or email. You could say, hey, I saw you in this story from the New York Times or from whatever. I'm, you know, here's a little bit about my background. I just need to know, do I qualify? Right? The one thing I do want to say is most people don't like answering questions that you can Google. Right? I think you're on mute, Delisha.
Right.
Most people are more open to answering questions that where you've already done your homework. Right? What's a question that shows you've already done your homework? I was reviewing the FAQ on, you know, the IRS's website, link to it, hyperlink to it, and it stated that this age group and this demographic would qualify, but I don't fit in that age group. So could you tell me a little bit more about whether I qualify?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
All right.
Does that make, yeah. Does that
Yeah,
make
that
sense?
makes a lot of sense. Most definitely.
A lot of it's just like kind of following, and I mean, you're thinking about being, you know, pursuing a more professional role in journalism, right? Or are you kind of doing this full time as a pursuit?
I haven't decided which field of journalism I'm going to yet.
There's a lot of places. Yeah, you can go a lot of different directions, right? But this is, I think, a lot of it's just finding, you know, in research. If you also decide to go the research route, it's always a research question, right? Like you have a question, and so you have to do some level of research, do your homework to find what are the potential answers to that question, right? And some answers are more accurate than others, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, how did you decide what type of journalism you wanted to do? I mean, you do writing, you make videos,
Yeah.
You know, like.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, I think for me, a lot of it, most of my life has always been very much, you know, very much driven by just being very adaptive. So I started writing at the Oakland Tribune, and I was just writing. And then the Oakland Tribune, because it was going through all these budget cuts, well, they didn't have any photographers. Like it was like half the photographers for stories that you were covering was doing all these features, and they would be like, "Oh, sorry, so and so isn't available because he's not working here anymore. So, do you mind taking a picture with your phone? Or here, the camera's here, the photographer's not here. Do you want to take the photo?
Mm-hmm.
And just include it with your story." I'm like, sure. I already knew photography anyways. And then sure enough, same thing with video. Hey, you know, we had to lay off our videographer. Would you mind taking some video? So then I'm teaching myself video. Oh, hey, you know what? We don't have much of an editor either. So would you mind editing your video? Sure. So then I would teach myself editing, video editing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to the industry, that's, you know, it became also really difficult for the folks working in those industries and those, because, you know, if a reporter can write and photograph and do video, well, that affects videographers and photographers' rates, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the industry has been changing quite a bit because of that, because increasingly reporters are asked to do more and more, right? So the business model has had to change.
Right.
I think for me, like I've been very good at forecasting. You know, like I actually literally like forecasting. Like, you know, if you know a storm's coming that day, are you going to leave your house without an umbrella?
No.
No, right? You know, like if you know that there's going to be a bunch of traffic on the slow pack is what Umberto calls it. Are you going to take the slow pack? No. Right? And so there's a certain amount of forecasting you're always doing in your life, even on a daily, you know, very practical way of planning your life. I think you can do that kind of forecasting, kind of a combination of forecasting and also like projecting towards that postcard, right? And so I think there's a lot of different ways to do it, right? I think for me, what's always worked is asking people along the way, you know, if they've gone, you know, which way they've gone along the path. And then I'm like, and then I weigh it out, right? Based on where I'm trying to get to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, most definitely. That makes sense.
I think we have a lot of questions here. I'm looking at the comments.
Oh, yeah. Let's jump into the comments from the audience.
Sure.
Start off with Karen's question. She said, what are you continuously doing? I mean, where are you continuously going to school?
Why are you always going to school, Car? How do they impact friendships? Oh, yeah, was I in the past? Yeah, I was. You know, it's interesting, Karen. This is a really interesting question. So I honestly got what I feel was a really great public education because I tested into the honors and the whole, you know, IB, AP system. And so the nice thing is that because of that, there's a set core curriculum. And so whichever school I went to, I would just be an AP or I would be an honors or I'd be an IB, right? And then I would just kind of like pick up where I left off. And so in terms of my education, I don't think that suffered too much. And I was always like reading in between. I was picking up a lot of syllabus and curriculum wherever, doing my homework in between to make sure. I was very, very much into school. I still am. I love school because it helps me make sense of things. It's very comforting to me to be able to read historical pieces, sociological pieces, and find a framework that helps me see things in a different way. I find that incredibly comforting. It did impact my friendships and how I trust people, but I think that's also what made me into a journalist, because I was very good at reading people and finding, looking for clues and alignment, that if they said something and they did something and there was alignment between like action, thought, and intention, that I could trust those people. And so I became very observant of who would say something but wouldn't do it, who would say something and would do it and would follow up. I think I trusted actions, how people acted more than what they said, I think, as a child. And I was very selective about who I could trust. So I think it taught me also as a journalist to work in difficult places where you have to really depend on different abilities for reading people and who you can trust as a source. That's a great question, Karen. Thank you.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for asking. Moving forward to a question from Chelsea. She said, Kara, what are some pointers or advice for creative sharing stories to audiences that may be triggering or an uncomfortable topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think more important than, I honestly don't feel that people should, I'm of the anti-fragile camp here. I think that it is important for people to see uncomfortable topics and to be to be aware of them. I also I think I'm more of the camp, like, how do you tell a story? How do you tell a story about a topic that's been covered in so many ways in the same way that it creates fatigue, right? Like the immigration topic, it's just like fatigue, right? Oh my God, another caravan. Oh my God, another this. Like, not more kids at the border, like, you know, and all this stuff. And I've actually literally heard people say this. And so how do you tell a story like that in a way that intrigues people or like makes them lean in, right? And so when we did La Camioneta, we were looking at a way to tell the story of immigration from a different perspective. And so we were like, you know what? Let's tell a story of a school bus that goes from the US to Guatemala, right? And that's immigration. It's an object, but somebody's driving it. And it's a Guatemalan, comes up to Pennsylvania, goes to an auction, buys this old school bus, drives it back. You know, Mark Kendall, the director, is filming it. And then we get to Guatemala, and then it's like, well, that's kind of like one-dimensional story. I'm like, yeah, but now you got to tell the story of the school bus in Guatemala, because Guatemala is a very different life for a school bus than rural Pennsylvania, right? And so then, you know, he's like, well, how do we tell that story? I was like, well, we have to ride along with the school bus, now bus, painted bus, been baptized and anointed, through different parts of Guatemala City, right? And in Guatemala City, there are gangs. And so a bus can't just go through different parts of Guatemala City without the driver paying a commission. And if the bus driver doesn't pay that commission, he gets threatened, or worse, murdered. Because it's not Pennsylvania, right? And so then by telling the story of the bus driver having to drive this bus around Guatemala City, you're also telling the story of how people have to live with that threat of violence and corruption and intimidation and co-opting of opportunities for them. And you start to go, oh, well, if it's hard for the bus and the bus driver, what's it like for the people? Right? And tragically, the person we were following, we did actually, you know, there was a situation in which we were able to film a bus driver that had just been murdered. We didn't include that in the film, but yeah, it's that often that it happens, right? And so I think you have to find a way to tell a story in a way that people can see it in a completely different way, right? That takes away some of the elements that might set off their initial defense mechanisms or triggers, right? You have to find a way in.
Right. All right. And then there was also a question from Lily as well. It's in, I mean.
How do you approach consolidating hours of footage and experience into digestible stories? This is a very good question, Tim. I actually have about 15 drives right now in my closet back there. Yeah, I think you have to know your footage, right? So yes, you actually have to know all your footage. When you're doing, and I have done documentaries, you have to really transcribe every bit of footage you have, which when you first do it, you're like, oh, I'm just gonna take footage of everything, right? Every interview, I'm gonna interview everybody. And when you first do it, you're like, oh, wow, that's a lot of transcribing. And then later on, you get more selective. You're like, since I'm gonna have to transcribe that, I might not need that interview, you know, because transcribing is very time consuming. But you got to know your footage. And then you go through, I actually will transcribe it, and then I will go through and look for the sound bites, right? And then I'll highlight the sound bites either, you know, on the document itself that's on the screen, or I'll print it out and highlight it. And then I'll look for things that are coming up over and over again, right? And common topics, common concerns. And then I'll start to see the stories, right? Based on what people are saying in the footage. And then you'll actually, I think when you get to know your footage really well, you'll start to see patterns and you'll start to see the story. And sometimes it'll be like one thing the person says, and you'll go, that's it, right? That's my entry point. And so you'll start to see and use that as an entry point into the bigger story.
Most definitely. That's definitely understandable. And we also had another question. Sorry, I'm moving so fast. We're running out of time. But Lily asks, thank you so much for sharing your story, but she wants to know how you see the nature of journalism shifting today, especially for Gen Z.
And Gen I, right? That's the big one.
Gen I?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the generation after Gen Z.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's completely different. Yeah, I think what I'm seeing is very, very different than when I first saw the imminent demise of the journalism model. And I think there's a lot of real diversity in the way that journalism is shifting today and the way the ecosystem is growing. There's a pretty big rise in independent media, not just in the US, but across the board. You see a lot of nonprofit journalism shops. You're starting to see a lot of collaborations between university and independent news organizations. You're starting to see a lot of foundations supporting different experiments and collaborations. You're starting to see the impact of international journalism, like, for example, with the Panama Papers, where an international coalition of media outlets can report on like shell companies, and then like a Panamanian journalist can use that and localize it to their context and get and actually get an investigation going. And so I think the role of international journalism is really, really seeing some traction now. I'm also starting to see and believe in the power of journalism to work as in a networked way, right? Where you see journalism working on a systemic problem and working together to find solutions in collaboration with civil society. Like what the work that Keith Hammonds is doing with the Solutions Journalism Network is pretty powerful, where journalism isn't just problematizing things anymore. It's actually taking more of an active role in helping citizens make sense of things and come up with viable solutions, not in an advocacy way, but in a way that like really frames things differently. And so journalism is really, and the journalist is starting to be a social actor. And I think that's really powerful, both nationally, locally, and internationally, right? And so I think it's a good time. It's really a good time to get into news and communication, right? Because journalism is only one aspect of communication. I love communication theory. There's strategic communication is also a really interesting field to get into now. So there's a lot of different ways you can go with it.
Most definitely. And thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thanks for having me.
I appreciate your talk, and it definitely gave me a better view of how to view journalists in journalism, and especially hearing your story and the things that you talk about. I have so many more questions to ask, but it's okay because I can send it through email. And if you got questions for her as well, y'all can add her on LinkedIn. It is in our comment section under this live right now. But we appreciate you coming so much. Did you have any lasting words you want to leave us with?
No, I really look forward to seeing what you write and produce, when you get into more journalism, Alicia.
Thank you. I'm excited to see what I'm going to do too, because I don't know. But thank you so much. And if you guys are interested in hearing more talks like this, you can join us here on Wednesdays at 12. Every Wednesday, we do a different talk with different people in the creative field about their creative journeys and pathways and how you can get into those fields as well. And if you're interested in taking a deeper dive or a next step into getting into these creative fields, make sure you check out the E4 Youth Creative Leadership Academy, which helps youth like myself and my peers jump into the creative industry and get jobs, whether it's right out of high school or college, and build our portfolios up. So check us out at e4youth.org. And if you are interested in contributing to the work that E4Youth is doing, make sure you go to e4youth.org/donate. We appreciate you guys so much, and we'll see you next week at 12. Bye.
Thank you.